The shed door creaked open, the rusty hinges crying out in protest. Inside, the air smelled of hay, sweat, and something else, something human. The rancher froze in the doorway. There, curled up on a pile of feed sacks, was a woman clutching a baby to her chest. Her dark hair was matted, her eyes wide and wild. And on the dirt floor beside her lay a rifle. He didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. Because the baby looked just like someone he'd buried years ago. A dry wind scraped across the plains that morning, carrying the smell of dust and sun-baked earth. The land stretched for miles in every direction, rolling hills, broken fences, and a lonely oak tree that had seen too many winters. James Callahan rode slow, reins loose in his hand, his eyes on the horizon like he always did. He wasn't much for talking. Folks in town called him quiet as a church graveyard. But out here, there wasn't much reason to speak anyway. His horse, a bay mare named Willow, picked her way down the rocky trail toward the creek. She knew the path well. James had been ranching this land since before the war. Before everything, the creek was low this year. No rain since May. James dismounted, crouched, and let the cool water run over his calloused hands. He cupped some to his mouth, but his eyes stayed on the tree line. Out here, a man learned never to turn his back on the wild. That's when he saw her, a figure, barely visible in the shimmering heat, standing on the far bank. Small, thin, a woman, holding something, wrapped in cloth that he didn't move, didn't call out. Because out here, strangers didn't just appear unless they needed something, or unless trouble was close behind. The woman's eyes locked on his. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Then, clutching the bundle tighter, she vanished into the cottonwoods. James stayed kneeling at the creek, his hand dripping water back into the current. He could have followed her, but he didn't. Instead, he finished watering Willow, mounted up, and rode home slow. Still, the image of her face, pale, sunburned, and desperate, hung in his mind like a ghost. The Callahan ranch wasn't much to look at. A sagging barn, a house with missing shingles, and a field of half-dead grass that had once been good grazing land. James stabled Willow, forked hay into the trough, and checked the fence line before heading inside. The place was quiet. Too quiet. Inside, the air felt wrong, like someone had been there. James reached for the shotgun by the door, the wood smooth from years of use. Then he heard it, soft, muffled. A whimper. He followed the sound to the shed out back. The door was shut, but not latched. Hand tight on the shotgun, James pushed it open and froze. There she was, the same woman from the creek. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She cradled the baby like her life depended on it. The child's cheeks were red, lips dry, but his eyes, God help him, those eyes were bright, familiar. The rifle on the floor caught James's attention, but she didn't reach for it. She just looked at him, chest rising and falling like a trapped animal. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, James lowered the shotgun just slightly. "Ma'am," he said, voice low. "You picked the wrong place to hide." Her grip on the baby tightened. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We just need somewhere. Just for a while." James studied her, really looked. The baby wasn't hers. He could see it in the way she held him. Careful, loving, but not like a mother would. And those eyes didn't lie. He felt the air grow heavy, the kind that settles right before a storm. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a chance meeting. "Where'd you get that child?" he asked quietly. The woman's lip trembled. Her eyes glistened. And James already knew, whatever she was about to say, it was going to drag him into something he'd tried to leave buried. Years ago, because that baby looked just like the man James had once called his brother. James stood in the doorway, the weight of the shotgun still heavy in his hands. The woman's eyes flicked between him and the exit, but she didn't run. She just rocked the baby gently, as if trying to shield him from the tension hanging in the air. "Answer me," James said, his voice calm but cold. "Where'd you get that child?" Her lip trembled. I can't tell you. If I do, they'll kill me." James lowered the shotgun slightly, but didn't put it down. "They?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "The men in town. The ones who did this." The baby whimpered softly. James felt his chest tighten. Those eyes, bright, piercing, so painfully familiar. He stepped inside the shed, slow, measured. "You need to leave," he said flatly. "Take the baby and go. Before someone sees you here." Her eyes widened. "Please, we've been walking for 2 days. He hasn't had milk since yesterday. If I take him out there, he'll die." James looked at the child again. The boy's cheeks were hollow, lips dry. He didn't cry like healthy babies do. Just small, weak whimpers. James's jaw tightened. He'd buried men before. He'd seen death close enough to smell it. But there was something about that boy that made him feel like walking away would be the same as pulling the trigger himself. Later that evening, James saddled Willow and rode into town. It was Saturday night, and the saloon doors swung open and shut with laughter spilling out. Horses were tied up along the street, their heads low as dust blew past their hooves. James pushed through the crowd and found Doc Weaver sitting alone at a table, a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. "Doc," James said quietly. Weaver looked up, eyes narrowing. "You don't come to town this late unless something's wrong." "I need milk," James said. Weaver frowned. "Milk? For a baby?" That got him a long stare. "You're too old to be starting over," Weaver muttered, trying to make light of it. But his eyes stayed sharp. James didn't answer. He just slid a few coins across the table. Weaver hesitated, then stood up. "Fine. But if you're mixed up in something, Callahan, you best be careful. Folks around here don't forgive easy." Back at the ranch, the woman sat by the hearth, the baby bundled in James's old wool blanket. The boy drank greedily from the bottle Weaver had given him, his tiny hands trembling. James leaned against the doorframe, watching quietly. "What's your name?" he asked finally. She didn't look up. "Clara." "And the boy?" Her eyes lingered on the child. "Thomas." James swallowed. The name hit harder than he'd expected. Clara seemed to notice. "You knew his father?" she said softly. It wasn't a question. James didn't answer. By morning, word had already started spreading that the general store, a ranch hand whispered to another, "Callahan's got a woman out at his place. A baby too." By noon, old Mrs. Perkins had told half the town that the child wasn't James's, and that meant trouble. The first man to ride out to the Callahan ranch was Sheriff Boone. He was a thick-set man with a permanent scowl and a badge that had been tarnished by too many years of looking the other way. "James," Boone said, tipping his hat without a smile. "Heard you got visitors." James stood on the porch, arms crossed. "And?" Boone spat into the dirt. "And folks are asking questions. Word is that woman's got trouble following her. You know how people get when they smell trouble." James didn't flinch. "She stays. The boy too." Boone shook his head slowly. "I ain't saying what you can or can't do, but I am saying that if those men from town come riding out here, I can't promise I'll stop him." His eyes lingered on James, heavy with meaning. Then Boone turned his horse and rode off, leaving nothing but dust behind. That night, Clara stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the moonlight. "They'll come for us," she whispered. James didn't answer. He sat at the table, oil lamp flickering, the shotgun leaning against the wall. "I can leave," she said, "if it'll keep you safe." James finally looked up at her. "That boy's got the same eyes as my brother. The same name, too. You leave, he dies. And I won't let that happen." Outside, an owl hooted. The night was still, but James could feel the change in the air. Somewhere out there, men were saddling their horses, and soon, trouble was coming down that road. The first sign came just after dawn, hoofprints in the dry earth along the ridge. James spotted them while checking the fence line. They weren't fresh enough to mean immediate danger, but they weren't old either. Someone had been watching that he crouched, fingers brushing the edges of the tracks. For riders, maybe 5, all heavy men, judging by the depth. They'd circled wide around the property, keeping to the hills. James straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. Nothing but waving grass and a sky as pale as bleached bone, but he knew better. Out here, trouble didn't always announce itself. Clara was quiet that morning. She stood by the hearth, holding Thomas close as the baby gurgled weakly in her arms. His cheeks were a little less sunken now, but his skin was still pale. "You need to pack a few things," James said, stepping inside. Her eyes shot to his. "Why?" "Because if they come, you ain't staying in the house. You'll take the boy to the creek. Hide in the cottonwoods." She hugged Thomas tighter. "And you?" James's jaw tightened. "I'll deal with whoever comes." By mid-morning, Sheriff Boone returned. This time, he didn't ride alone. Two deputies flanked him, their rifles resting easy in their hands. Boone dismounted slow, his boots crunching against the dry earth. "James," he said, voice heavy with warning. "You know why I'm here." James didn't move from the porch. "You can tell me." Boone glanced back at his deputies, then lowered his voice. "Last night, Luke Harper's boys were in the saloon. They were drinking," Logan bragged Jin, "about how they left some girl with a bastard baby. Nobody said a damn word to stop him." James's grip on the railing tightened. "They're riding this way," Boone continued. "Said they'd collect what's theirs and deal with anyone standing in their way. You know what that means." James's voice was flat. "Yeah, I know." Boone exhaled, slow. "I ain't here to take her. But I can't stop him either. Not with the way folks in town see her." James's eyes didn't waver. "Then I'll stop him." Boone stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, grim, and swung back into his saddle. "God help you, Callahan," he muttered before riding off. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, Thomas asleep in her lap, while James sat at the table cleaning his rifle. The lamplight flickered across his weathered face, deepening the lines etched there by years of loss. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. James didn't look up. "Yes, I do. You don't even know me." He finally met her eyes. "I know that boy. I know whose blood runs in his veins." "That's enough." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Near midnight, Willow's ears twitched, and she snorted softly in her stall. James heard it instantly. He stood, rifle in hand, and stepped to the door. Far out on the road, he saw lanterns bobbing like fireflies, 4 of them, moving slow but steady toward the ranch. The air felt colder, though the night hadn't changed. James stepped back inside, his face calm but set. "They're here," he said quietly. Clara's arms tightened around Thomas. "You know where to go," James said, opening the back door to the night. She hesitated, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "James, go." Clara slipped out into the darkness, clutching Thomas to her chest. The door closed softly behind her. The riders came in slow, their horses' hooves crunching over the dry earth. James stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching them draw closer. Luke Harper led the way, broad shoulders, cruel eyes. A man who had never been told no. Well, Luke drawled as he reined in. "Didn't think you'd be fool enough to keep her here, Callahan." James didn't move. "She's not yours." Luke smirked. "She's whatever I say she is. And that brat, he's mine too. You hand him over now, we'll all ride away happy." James's rifle stayed steady. "That boy stays here. And you're going to turn your horse around." Luke chuckled, shaking his head. "You always were the righteous one. But here's the thing. Righteous don't count for much when you're outnumbered." The other men shifted in their saddles, hands brushing their pistols. James didn't flinch. "You're not talking that boy," he said softly. For the first time, Luke's smirk faltered. The night held its breath. And then, from somewhere deep in the cottonwoods, a baby's cry broke the silence. Luke's eyes lit with cruel satisfaction. "Well," he said, drawing his pistol slow. "Sounds like you just told me where they are." James didn't move. The rifle stayed steady against his shoulder, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. Luke's grin widened. "You ain't got it in you, Callahan. You always thought you were better than the rest of us. Thought you could keep your hands clean." The men behind him shifted uneasily. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. "Put the gun down," James said softly. "Right away." Luke leaned forward in his saddle. "You gonna shoot me in cold blood? Over some girl you don't even know?" James's eyes stayed locked on his. "Over a boy who's got my brother's eyes." Something flickered across Luke's face. Confusion, then anger. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You know damn well," James said. "Your boys bragged in the saloon about what they did. But that boy ain't yours, Luke. He's Thomas Callahan's son." The words landed like a hammer point. One of Luke's men shifted in his saddle. "Luke, that true?" Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. James stepped down off the porch, rifle still aimed. The dirt crunched under his boots as he closed the distance. "You left my brother for dead outside Wichita," James said quietly. "And you took what wasn't yours. But this boy, he's mine to protect now. And if you want him, you're gonna have to kill me first." For a long moment, no one breathed. Luke's pistol trembled, just slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by a man who looked ready to die for it. Then Clara's voice broke the silence. She stepped from the cottonwoods, Thomas in her arms, her face pale but resolute. "You're a coward, Luke Harper," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You and your boys, all of you. You laughed when you took what wasn't yours. You thought no one would ever make you answer for it." Her words cut sharper than any blade. Thomas stirred in her arms, his tiny hand clutching at her dress. Luke's men glanced at each other, unease spreading through them like wildfire. "Look at him," Clara said, holding Thomas higher. "You think he deserves to grow up knowing his father was a monster? You think that's what makes you a man?" The fire in her voice made even James glance at her. For the first time since he'd met her, Clara didn't look like a frightened girl running for her life. She looked like someone who had finally decided she'd run far enough. One of Luke's men dismounted slowly. He dropped his reins and stepped back. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered. Another followed, his eyes downcast. Luke looked around, realizing he was standing alone. His pistol wavered, then lowered, just slightly. "You think you're better than me, Callahan?" Luke spat. "No," James said softly. "I just stopped letting men like you win." Luke sneered, but there was no fight left in it. With a sharp tug on his reins, he turned his horse. "This ain't over," he muttered, but even he knew it was not. When the sound of hoofbeats finally faded, Clara sank to her knees, clutching Thomas to her chest. James lowered the rifle slowly. His hands were steady, but the weight of the moment settled heavy on his shoulders. Clara looked up at him, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Thank you," she whispered. James crouched down in front of her. He brushed the hair back from Thomas's tiny face, his calloused hand strangely gentle. "You don't owe me thanks," he said quietly. "He's my brother's son. I should have been there years ago." Clara shook her head. "You couldn't have known." James didn't answer. He just looked at the boy. Really looked. Thomas's eyes were bright, unblinking, and full of a life that deserved better than the men who had left him to die. For the first time in years, James felt something deep in his chest, something like purpose. That night, they didn't speak much. James sat by the fire, the rifle leaning against the wall. Clara cradled Thomas, humming softly under her breath. Every so often, James's eyes would wander to them, quiet but watchful. When she finally looked up, her voice was soft. "Was your brother a good man?" James nodded slowly. "The best I knew. He just trusted the wrong people." Clara's gaze dropped to Thomas. "Then I'll make sure he knows who his father was, and who stood up for him when no one else would." The fire popped softly in the hearth. James leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty, but as the wind picked up outside, rustling the cottonwoods, James knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Men like Luke Harper didn't just disappear, and the boy sleeping in Clara's arms, Thomas Callahan's son, was now a reason to fight for something more than just survival. Morning broke quietly over the plains, the sky painted in soft streaks of gold and pink. The air was cool, still, the kind of morning that felt like it was holding its breath. James stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the land wake up. Willow grazed lazily near the fence line, her ears twitching with every distant sound. Inside, Clara sat at the table, Thomas in her lap. The boy's cheeks were fuller now, color slowly returning to his face. "He's stronger today," Clara said softly as James stepped back inside. James glanced at them, his expression unreadable but softer than before. "Good." A week passed, then two. Word spread that Luke Harper had left town. Some said he was running from shame, others that he was planning revenge, but no one came. Sheriff Boone stopped by once, his face tired but relieved. "Whole damn town's talking," he muttered, leaning against the porch post. "But folks are starting to see Luke for what he is. Maybe that's something." James didn't answer, just nodded once. Boone gave him a long look. "You keep that boy safe, Callahan. Feels like you're the only man left who will." Then he mounted up and rode away, leaving James with the weight of words he already knew were true. Life settled into something close to routine. James worked the land like he always had, mending fences, tending to the cattle. But there was a difference now, a reason to come back to the house at night. Clara learned to cook over the old wood stove, laughing softly when she burned the bread for the third time in a row. James found himself smiling more, though never quite enough for her to notice. Sometimes, late at night, Clara would tell Thomas stories about his father, about the life he should have had. James would sit nearby, silent, listening. "You'll know him through us," she whispered one evening as Thomas dozed off. "You'll know he was loved." James turned away then, staring at the fire so she wouldn't see the way his eyes burned. Months passed. The land changed with the seasons, fields turning from brown to green to gold again. One evening, Clara stepped onto the porch, Thomas toddling at her side. "He took his first steps today," she said, her face glowing with quiet pride. James knelt down, holding out his arms. Thomas wobbled toward him, tiny legs unsteady but determined. When the boy finally fell into James's arms, he held him tight, feeling something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Clara watched from the doorway, her eyes soft, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she didn't look like a woman running from her past. She looked like someone who had finally found a place to rest. Years later, the Callahan ranch looked different. The fences stood straight, the barn repaired, the fields alive with cattle again. A young man, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with eyes just like James's brother, worked the land with steady hands. Thomas Callahan had grown strong, carrying himself with the quiet strength of the man who'd raised him. Clara watched from the porch, pride shining in her eyes. James stood beside her, older now, lines deeper on his face, but his shoulders still square, his presence still steady. "He's a good man," Clara said softly. James nodded, watching Thomas lead the horses to water, just like his father. For a long while, they stood together in silence, the wind whispering through the grass. The world outside still held men like Luke Harper, cruel, cowardly, ready to take what wasn't theirs. But here, on this patch of land, there was something stronger, something worth keeping. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire, Thomas sat with James on the porch. "Was my father really like you say?" Thomas asked, his voice deep now, steady. James smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both grief and pride. "He was better," James said. "But I reckon you turned out just like him." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Once, the weight of those words settling deep, and as the prairie wind rustled through the fields, James realized something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the kind you find in silence or solitude, but the kind that comes when you finally stop running from ghosts, the kind that comes when you choose to fight for what's right and live. To see it grow. The shed still stood out back, weathered and leaning, the same place where it had all begun, but now it was just a shed, because the boy who had once cried inside it now ran free under the open sky, and the man who had opened that door carried no more doubt about the choice he'd made.